is going on, world of Ethereum? Welcome back to Ethereum Hot and Spicy, episode number 6. Today, we're going to talk about, I think, some pretty interesting and pertinent topics, which is going to be governance.
The spiciest.
The spiciest. Billy and myself think we can save Ethereum in less than 30 minutes, so that's what we're going for. We'll do quick introductions again. My name is Kames, wonderful all-around Ethereum developer. And it seems to be my tagline, no longer with Consensus. And Billy, if you want to do a quick introduction.
Billy's still with Consensus for now, until they fire me. Yeah, also all-arounder, less developer-y than Kames, but
still a rock star.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, and about to save Ethereum with Kames in 26 minutes. We'll see how it goes.
I think we can do it. So let's just jump right into it. Today, as I said, we're going to talk about governance. And so just to preface a little bit and add a little bit of context for people who are new to Ethereum or maybe don't follow the governance as much as everyone else. So because Ethereum is a decentralized protocol, but decisions still need to be made, there's this idea of governance around it. And the biggest part of this governance is deciding what goes into what we call clients. And clients are the software that runs for miners who are basically mining cryptocurrency, and there are certain rules and implementations that go in there. And a lot of these talks are kind of boxed into what we call Ethereum Improvement Proposals, or EIPs. And there's a lot of hot ones going on recently. There's a couple that are really contentious, ProgPoW and a few others. And so that's kind of what we're going to dive in today. Billy, do you want to add anything to that about like governance and what's going on with Ethereum?
Sure, yeah. And to Cam's point, so in like traditional systems, you tend to have, or I don't even want to say traditional, but like nowadays the status quo is to have kind of top-down command and control hierarchy as your governance process. So like governance is like there are leaders that make decisions and then those decisions kind of get enacted. And I mean, you can have like democratic voting processes as your governance mechanism. There's a bunch of different ways you can govern things, but generally like in Ethereum, the topic of governance is a little bit weird because it's meant to be kind of this just like decentralized open source movement. And so it's like, who makes the decisions if there's no hierarchy? Like who ultimately decides where the protocol goes and what decisions are made with respect to the protocol? And so that's kind of what Kames was getting at, was like, there's these things called EIPs, Ethereum Improvement Proposals, and those are proposals to change you can just view it as like to change Ethereum generally. And so who decides which EIPs get approved and put into code? And so that is, it's always been very contentious and just kind of like a thing that hasn't been figured out really amongst these like really decentralized open source movements. I mean, some groups have definitely had success. A lot of a decent amount of groups have had success, but I don't know if like the optimal solution has been found, and we're looking for an optimal solution today, especially in light of some of these more contentious EIPs. So yeah, that's kind of what we'll be talking about. Was that okay, James?
Billy, that was phenomenal. Well said. Great context. And so just to continue off that, let's add a little bit of more information so people know what's going on. So every once in a while, I think it's like pretty regularly, like once a month or something, there's a meeting called the Core Devs Call. And what happens is a lot of the people who basically write the clients, who research a lot of the protocols, and who are just part of this day-to-day process of figuring out what's going to be included in these clients, which is like the Geth client, and then which was once known as the Parity client, but is now being taken over by the Gnosis team, and it's called, I think it's Open Ethereum Foundation org, and so they're doing that. And so what's happening is most of the time, from what I can tell, it's pretty nice, and people kind of agree, and it's mainly around technical discussions. But what's happening now is because there's, as we keep saying, this contentious EIP, which is this ProgPoW, Prog proof of work, is some people highly disagree with it, and some people think it's great. And so for a little context, what this Ethereum proposal is basically no longer allowing certain miners to be able to participate in the Ethereum protocol. And so what happened was Ethereum originally started out wanting to exclude ASIC miners, which is hardware specifically created to mine cryptocurrency, where the normal is, or I wouldn't say normal, but the standard is basically anybody who has GPUs, which is graphics cards that you process video games on, and is pretty intensive compared to CPUs, can basically set up a mining rig and start to mine cryptocurrency. And so what's happening is this proposal is going to change the hashing algorithm to attempt to prevent ASICs, which are highly specialized and can outcompete these GPU miners by orders of magnitude. And is there anything else should we add to that? Do you think there's a little more information or anything that you want to kind of bring context to?
Just a little bit. So the reason why Ethereum wanted to be ASIC resistant is because with ASICs comes centralization. Like the more efficient ASICs you have, the more you kind of like centralize mining power amongst the people who can create the ASICs or the people who have the money to buy the ASICs. And so like if you want the whole reason Ethereum originally wanted to be ASIC resistant is because we wanted like this optimally decentralized system where the people participating in the mining process were your everyday person with the GPU. Like everyone can get a GPU. Like some people can set up GPU mining farms to have like way more computing or computing power or whatever. But generally like the discrepancy between your like everyday miner and the efficiencies that like industrial miners can get is like somewhat, the curve is kind of flattened. Whereas if you have these ASICs and they're like extremely efficient and only certain people can are able to produce them or access them, or who want to expend the money to just like specifically buy this piece of hardware, things just get a little bit more centralized. And so these ASICs have started getting developed. More and more powerful ASICs are getting developed. And so this ProgPoW is a proposal to change the algorithm to be ASIC resistant and get rid of like these ASIC miners and go back to like the original vision for Ethereum, which was only being able to be mined by GPUs.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I think that was like a really great context. It's all about basically democratizing access and ensuring our decentralized protocol is indeed decentralized. So I know you, Billy, you mentioned before you were going to do a little bit more research and you probably came up with some good information. And before you dive into that, I'll quickly share kind of my understanding of why we should or some of the beliefs of why ProgPoW could happen. And this is probably my very limited view. But this is kind of how I'm perceiving it. And then hopefully you can add a little more context and a few of the opinions of some of the experts. But, I think if you've been following Ethereum for a long time, from the beginning, the get-go, it was stated that we eventually wanted to move to proof of stake. And proof of stake would no longer need these GPU miners. They would no longer need these ASIC miners. And so how I understand it is when we make that switch, there is a potential for a hard fork. Like all these people have invested a large amount of capital to make these mining farms to basically produce cryptocurrency. And so what the potential is if we don't get rid of some of these miners, I don't want to say get rid of, but basically de-incentivize buying that hardware before we move to proof of stake, it's much more likely those people will continue to run this proof of work algorithm, and there could be a potential hard fork. So if we now start to eliminate certain players before that switch, i.e. the ASIC miners, there's less of a chance for them to take over the network because they've left months or maybe years ahead of time. And so in my mind, it seems very reasonable, and some might argue almost like 4D chess, to start getting rid of some of these ASIC miners now, so there's less of a chance later that they'll hard fork when we switch to ETH 2.0. So that's kind of my belief on ProgPoW and kind of how I'm seeing it. but there's a ton of opinions and a lot of information to dive into. But I'd love to kind of hear what, some of the research that you came across today, Billy, and just like some of the different opinions for why you think people are advocating for or against this ProgPoW improvement proposal.
Yeah, and I'll just preface this by saying I have not been following this conversation like very closely. I've just kind of seen it pop up recently, so I spent like a little bit of time diving in. But basically, like my understanding is, Ethereum was supposed to be only GPU mined from the beginning. And so I think it's like pretty hard to argue against the fact that against wanting to fork ASICs away. I don't see like that generally being contentious. I think the point of contention might be, are ASIC miners kind of detrimental to the point where a hard fork is warranted? Like the system's running like pretty good now. Like in the face of like this migration to proof of stake, are things like, do we think that there is, I guess, sufficient centralization to warrant, or like in Kames, like to the point that Kames make, like, is there a sufficient argument to implement this in the face of the fact that this would be implementing some kind of, I guess, never before implemented in production technology that would result in a hard fork, which could cause some potential problems to go wrong with the system. So like that's, I guess, kind of the only argument that I think anyone who's not an ASIC miner can make. But I think obviously the ASIC miners are going to fight tooth and nail against this and maybe manipulate things behind the scenes because they've invested a lot of money in these ASIC miners and they are extremely incentivized to do whatever they can to not get ProgPoW through. So I think those are like the two arguments against it. But I think there's also, I guess the arguments for it are increased decentralization, always wanted GPUs from the beginning. And what Kames said of there at the time of the switch to entirely proof of stake consensus mechanism, there will be a chain split. There will be a group that continues the proof of work chain. And I think we probably should get rid of some of those people sooner rather than later. So I don't know. That's generally what I've been. Those are like the arguments, but why I think this is so interesting is because I think this is being viewed by a lot of people as the first opportunity for us to harden our governance system. So this is the first like truly, I guess besides the DAO hack, like one of the first truly contentious governance decisions that needs to be made. And so this is ultimately just culminating in this like very interesting conversation around how do we make these decisions. And so I think that's like kind of the most interesting part about this, whether or not you're for or against ProgPoW. I think the bigger story here is how do we do Ethereum governance properly?
Yeah, well said, because we could definitely dive in, I think, into a lot of the technicals and what are the reasons for and against, and we totally should at some point. And maybe that's video number 2. But I think explicitly we should stay around governance. So, we have about 15 minutes left, Billy, to save Ethereum, and we have to figure out this governance topic. So is there anything that comes to mind for you in something that we kind of need to make better or improve this process where when contentious issues like this arise, how do we better basically solve these issues? Because as of right now, it's a small handful of people who are called core devs. And they, at the end of the day, basically get to decide kind of like what's going on, what's the discussion. So do we lean more towards basically community input for people who may not be as technical but have a skin in the game, and we come up with like better systems of like voting, whether that's carbon voting, token voting, or something else? Or yeah, just what is the way that we can basically start to enact maybe more democratic values, or a process for ensuring when something like this contentious pops up that the entire community doesn't split and we don't just like ruffle each other's feathers on Twitter? So is there anything that comes to mind for you that ways we could start to improve this process?
Dude, it's such a hard question. I think one of the biggest points of contention was like a ninja edition of the EIP, and that like turned a lot of people off from ProgPoW, like the fact that some people try to just like slip it in and get it passed. And I think a big problem around that is the fact that there's not really like a standardized process for EIP approval. It's not like, all right, there's these 20 committee members, and if 18 of these committee members approve it, then it's good. Like, at least not that I'm aware of. Like, maybe like unofficially that's maybe kind of how it works, but there's not like a Ethereum technical steering committee. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think there's maybe a lot of lessons to be learned from other kind of open source decentralized projects that have existed in the past. And I think a lot of those have had something that looks like a representative elected technical steering committee that is like the voice on a lot of these things. And to that point, I think Ethereum generally has done a really good job of kind of figuring out what the sentiment of the community is through like extremely informal channels, like voting or just browsing Twitter and Reddit. So I think we should like continue to hear the voice of the community as much as possible, but those things are so easily gamified, and so we need to figure something out. Like, actually, I just saw this. Maybe like,
let's hear it, Billy. Let's hear
like,
that hot spicy take.
Sybil resistance via verifiable claims, and then like we know who the people are who are saying the things that they're saying and who are voting the ways that they're voting. I don't know. Maybe that's like one step in the right direction. I think like probably.
So just before we dive down a little bit,
Yeah.
I have a couple questions on that. So just to clarify, are you saying like if we were to get a better sense of what the crowd's thinking and what people are saying, are you saying like we would need verifiable credentials for individuals, or are you saying we need like to be more specific who are the core devs? Because as far as I can tell, it's kind of well known who these core devs are, but we don't know who some of these Twitter people are, and maybe they're running like 10,000 Twitter bots and they're all like voting a certain way. So are you saying just like better sense of who those individuals are?
Yeah, I think the core dev kind of process or whatever is like, even though it's like kind of in a little bit more informal, like people can just like kind of hop on those calls and whatever, but I think that's going all right. I think maybe a little bit more rigidity and structure there could be good, but yeah, I was more getting at like we need to take into account the voice of the community, but how do we ensure that the voice that we're hearing is actually representative of the community? And so people try to figure out these different ways to kind of understand like who people are who are saying specific things and how much of a stake they have in the game. So I think like to some extent, like token weighted voting is good, but then you have like the problem of exchanges basically being able to control everything because they have all the tokens. But yeah, just generally like ensuring that like we need to devise a good mechanism to ensure that the sentiment of the stakeholders that we are taking into account is like actually an accurate sentiment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I guess for me, before we get to this larger sentiment of the crowd and people who may not be technical, what I would like to see, and hopefully, I can get a couple people to bandwagon with me on this, I would like to see a much better vetting process for who the core devs are and what their incentives are. So like, do you work for a mining company? Do you just work for the Ethereum Foundation? Like, what is your reason for being in this process? And I would love to see basically proposals where you vote on who should be on the official core devs, and that itself would be voted on by the community. So they would have just the same way we elect officials and people who, for the United States Senate and Congress, where it's like you basically hand over and you delegate your votes to people who are in that process every day. And so I think it's going to be, we're going to have to move because there's so much value in Ethereum right now and cryptocurrencies, like literally billions of dollars, that we're going to have a more formal process, especially if we want big companies to come play in our sandbox and our playgrounds that we're making. They're going to have confidence or feel like they are able to participate in that governance process, whether that's directly or indirectly. So what I would love to see is even like on the Ethereum website or somewhere else is a list of who these core devs are, who they work for, what do they do, like what's their profile, how long have they been in this industry, and just to get a sense of like who these people are. Because I don't even think there's a list right now, and I could be wrong on this one, of who these core devs are.
That's
right?
a good point.
And so I think just starting at a fundamental like transparency level of that would allow us to peer in a little bit more to this governance process. And I think we should get to what you're proposing, which is a much bigger community buy-in and say and participation beyond just Twitter. Cause you can't really have Twitter governance, or maybe you can, I don't know. But yeah, I think advocating for that and hopefully, and maybe we propose that, maybe with this video can be the start of that. But yeah, having more transparency of who the core devs are, how they got there, and then how do we either elect them or like diselect them and get them out of that process. Because I was reading a tweet today, and I don't know his first name, but he goes by DC Investor on Twitter. And he was advocating, and not really in a trolly way. It was like, how do you even know like when it's time to basically get a core dev off of the core dev meeting? And they're incentivized to not really call out their peers because it's like, not a social norm. You don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to ostracize other people. So if we could take away that kind of burden from the core devs themselves and allow some transparent process for a bigger community to have that say, I think it would offer some solutions to this very difficult process.
1,000,000% agree. And I think
1 million devs, baby.
Yeah, like that shirt. So yes, and I think that I feel like people will be generally accepting of this because we're like the whole ecosystem and all of Ethereum's for transparency, and I don't think the lack of transparency is a result of people being against transparency generally. I think it's just a lack of like setting up some of this core infrastructural stuff that would allow for better transparency, like a list on a website. Like I think just like nobody's done that. It's not like because they're against it. It's just like nobody like picked up the reins to actually do that. But I think it would be cool to see like who the core devs are, what their background is, maybe what they voted historically, and like what their current vote is on certain things that are in the proposal pipeline. So you can like, especially if we have like elected representatives, so you know how someone's voting, so you can in the next cycle. I think we should have like relatively quick cycles where we have to re-vote for who the core devs are. I don't think they should be like elected for like an extended period of time, especially since our ecosystem moves so fast. But I would love to like get more transparency into who they are, how they're voting, so we can properly elect the right ones. And yeah, I think that would go a long way. I would also like, honestly, Vitalik, dude, step up. Like, I know like we don't want to have a leader, and it's like not good to have a leader, but like in extremely contentious scenarios, like sometimes we do. Like, what if it's a split vote? And this is like personal opinion. This is probably not even the best idea, but like it's probably the worst idea ever. But I think if there's like a split vote, like consensus, or Vitalik is like the president, and he's just like the ultimate arbiter of the situation, and he should just like hit the gavel and be like, hey guys, I'm right. Let's do it this way. I don't know.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're advocating for a president. Like he's got veto
Yeah.
power and he's got the ability to, the final say if there's a split down the middle. So we're running out of time. We both got to hop in a couple minutes, but like for the final thing, what do you think is like the next small step that we as a community can take to kind of help fix this governance kind of challenge that we face today? Is it something that we just covered right now? Do we just start with better transparency? Like I really liked this idea of voting history, because right now, as far as I can say, it's like this very informal process of like where you go A or nay and the loudest crowd wins, and like that's not very easy to track, right? Unless you go watch all the videos and you kind of listen to what's going on. So yeah, what do you think in a couple of seconds, like is the next small step forward we can take to as a community? What are some of the tools that we could possibly build?
Yeah, and I don't even know what all the things we're voting on are or what they're voting on are. So I think like, dude, this is such a low lift. It just literally one web page, show who like a list of core devs, their backgrounds. We don't even need like how they voted yet. Like maybe we can do future facing votes. Like maybe a little pipeline that shows all of the things that are being debated right now and that are coming up for voting. And then, yeah, and then just like a record of how people have voted on those different things. I feel like that should take someone like a day to build. I don't know. That's like the MVP, and then we can take it from there.
So I have an idea. So recently the team at Graph Protocol launched this application called Everest last week, which was the ability to basically propose, other projects within the Ethereum ecosystem, and you have to stake 10 DAI and you can get on this list. So what if we basically fork that UI, but instead of proposing projects in the Ethereum ecosystem, you have to propose people who are on the core devs call, and we start to get this transparent list of just who these people are. And that way we can have this decentralized project that allows you to kind of pay or stake to get people on this list, and people then can discuss that if it's valid.
From like one Twitter thread that I read today, it seemed like there was like an approved core dev list already. Is that true?
That could be. I think, but even the fact that we don't know and we've been around this system so long kind of proves that unless you're like super nitty gritty, it's really tough to find this information.
Yep, that's a good point.
So I think we've hit the half-hour mark, and unfortunately, we both have to hop, but we should definitely have a round two. Maybe we pick this up again tomorrow, even though we're trying to get a good cadence, but this is a really important topic. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along on this quick but hopefully informative journey, and you can catch our next video because I think we're definitely going to talk about this again because it's so important. So any final words before we hop off, Mr. Billy?
No, yeah. I think we should absolutely talk about this more. And if anyone's watching this and you have like good ideas or a strong opinion on ProgPoW, like I would love to get some, like if we could get some guest appearances to talk about this. I think this is one of the topics that could probably benefit the most from someone who's been tracking this a little bit more closely.
Yeah, I agree. Let's invite somebody on, even if it's not someone who's in the day-to-day, but just more people and voicing their opinions about how we do governance, like, is obviously going to help. That's not going to hurt. So we should totally do that next round. Let's invite some people on.
Cool. Awesome.
All right. Ethereum Hot and Spicy, episode number 6. Thank you for coming.
Thanks all.